Mr. Hunt, this final set of questions won't be in a particular chronological or thematic order because they're specific points I've been asked to raise from a number of different sources. Could we go to, please, Lawrence, DHSC 0050028. This is really just a potential point of correction to a document. So we can see there's a date at the top of the page, 7th of July 2017, and I think that's the date that then perfectly understandably appears in your statement. If we go to page 3, paragraph 13, we can see the last bullet point refers to, on the 9th of July, the Sunday Times publishing a letter to the Prime Minister signed by the leaders of all opposition parties calling for a public inquiry. So I'm really asked just to point out that it may be that the date of the 7th of July on this is inaccurate, and it might perhaps be the 10th of July. It's obviously before the announcement or the final decision that's taken. So that's that. We can take that down, thank you. When I was asking you earlier about the decision-making as regards a public inquiry, you said that it was the view or the knowledge that an inquiry would recommend large sums of money or compensation that was a deterrent factor. Does it follow that there was an underlying acceptance within number 10 in the department that an inquiry would be likely to find that there was wrongdoing, which would then point to compensation?
I don't know if that's necessarily true, and I think that we're obviously all waiting to see what you conclude in this inquiry. To me, it seems likely that there was wrongdoing, but I think the view was that it would cost money anyway, because irrespective of whether there was wrongdoing, there had been injustice, and that's why an inquiry would be likely to recommend more generous support from families than had been forthcoming to date.
When we looked at those three options that you set out in your letter to the Prime Minister in June 2015, an aspect of one of them was the provision of accelerated treatment, so access to the new or then new hepatitis C treatments for those who have hepatitis C as a result of infection through blood and blood products. Now, we know why that option didn't go ahead. We've discussed that. But was any consideration given by you or to your knowledge, the department, to asking NHS England to structure the rollout of the new hepatitis C treatments so as to ensure those infected at the hands of the NHS access those treatments quickly?
Yes, to my knowledge, that was the first question I asked. Could we just treat the people who've been affected by this scandal first? But I was told that that wouldn't be ethical because essentially the NHS treats people with the greatest clinical need first. And so to give accelerated treatment to people with lower clinical need would mean that people with a higher clinical need who are unaffected by this scandal would be deprioritised. And so for that reason, if we wanted to accelerate treatment for everyone affected by this scandal, curious though it might sound, and I did query it when I was asked it, but the only way to do that would be to pay for the treatment to be given privately. But I still felt that it didn't really matter how you chose to skin the cat. We needed to get this treatment done quickly to people affected by this scandal. So I was prepared to support that option, even though it wasn't ultimately accepted.
And then turning to the decision-making in July 2017 regarding the establishment of the public inquiry, was it the case, and this picks up on what you said in your statement about a moment where the government was distracted or weakened, and you referred to the Diana Johnson debate, was it the case that the DUP had threatened to withdraw their support for the government if there was not a public inquiry, with potentially then jeopardising the government's ability to remain in power?
Not to my knowledge.
You used the phrase earlier about the government not marking its own homework. Should there be an independent body or panel able to order independent investigations when there are concerns about patient safety or public health, rather than waiting for the Secretary of State to do so?
It's an interesting question. I can understand the logic for that. I certainly think that the Secretary of State should have the ability to ask for independent investigations to be done quickly and easily. And there is an organisation that's now been set up called HSSIB, which is the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, which we set up in shallow form when I was Health Secretary, which theoretically which can do safety investigations on any issue it chooses without reference to the Secretary of State, and so it can go without fear or favour, and anyone who gives evidence to those investigations has legal privilege. There has to be a court order before any identities of anyone who gives evidence is revealed. So we have moved in that direction. But I think the fundamental problem is a cultural one, which is that there's a sort of blame culture, which means that everyone is frightened about being open and transparent when there have been mistakes. And so the result is there's still too much covering up going on and not enough learning from mistakes. And so, you know, in a way, it would be much better to address that fundamental problem of culture so that you didn't need to have these independent inquiries in the first place, because the system self-corrected. It was hungry to find out where things had gone wrong and try to sort things out for the future.
And then looking specifically at government and not the NHS, how can government be subject to greater internal challenge? Do you have any suggestions?
It's a really important question to answer, and I think that there are lots of things that one could do. I mean, the first thing is that it's very important, the relationship that a minister has with their officials. And I found that one of the problems in my 3 cabinet jobs was that ministers were often, as we talked about earlier, a bit too deferential. And they were very keen to do what you asked them to do. But if you had an idea that was completely balmy, they sometimes didn't tell you. And actually, you really need people who will say, that's a completely mad idea, Secretary of State, and it won't work because of this, this, this. And that doesn't happen as much as it should. And you need to have enough trust. And also people need to see enough of you. You need to have officials who are in and out of your office every day, so they're very comfortable being around you. I used to prefer people calling me by my first name, but a lot of officials found that very difficult because it's quite a formal structure inside the civil service. So I think one of the things is to build teams around you who there's enough trust that you can just talk very openly and say, you know, don't do this, do that, and so on. But I think also there is a role for transparency. I believe we made some very big mistakes in the first few months of the pandemic. And one of the reasons was that SAGE's advice to ministers in those early months was wrong. They recommended suspending the test and trace programme in the early stages of the pandemic. That's obviously this matter for another public inquiry rather than this one. But the point is, if that advice to ministers had been published in the public domain, then I think lots of other scientists up and down the country would have said there's something wrong here. And you'd have had scrutiny and challenge. And we would have got onto the right policy more quickly than we actually did. So I think transparency does have a role. But I think the most important thing that encourages a constructive culture inside government is what we talked about earlier, which is just moving away from this blame culture where if you admit you did something wrong, you're going to get fired, which is often not the case, but people worry it might be the case. And recognising that sometimes people are going to make mistakes, and you need to allow people the chance to learn from their mistakes and grow.
And going back then to the funding that was found within the department's own budget, so the 25 million from the contingency pot and then the 100 million that you referred to, is it right to understand that that having been found from the department's existing budget, that there was no consequential funding for the devolved administrations?
I don't know the answer. I was trying to think about that when you asked me the questions earlier, but I don't think there was any consequential funding because that came from our NHS budget for England, and the NHS budget for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland had been given to them, and the increases in the NHS budget in England. So when we announced an extra £10 billion to the NHS in England in 2015, that had consequential impact on the NHS budgets for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the additional money we found came from that money. So I think the Barnett consequentials had already happened.
We talked about what the department might have anticipated from the Penrose inquiry, and my understanding from your evidence was that it was thought that the Penrose inquiry might make recommendations in relation to, or recommendations that might lead to financial payments. Do you know what the basis for that anticipation was in the department? Was that just an expectation that it was an obvious thing to do, or was it based upon some concrete information about the course of the inquiry?
I don't think it was based on any concrete information. I just think we thought there's an independent inquiry happening in Scotland, and that may well recommend a much more generous framework for families, and then we would feel under strong obligation to do the same in England. And we were a bit surprised when it didn't do that.
The next questions talk about where money might come from within government. And the first question is this: why does it appear to be automatically assumed within government that any money is required for the support of those infected and affected through blood and blood products required to be treated as monies falling within the ambit of the health budget?
Well, that is the way that government works. So they would, the Treasury's view would be, we give the Department of Health the biggest budget in the whole of government. It's a huge strain on national resources paid for by taxpayers. So if there are any issues that happen in that area, then you have to consume your own smoke. So that would always be the default in any discussion, and that the Treasury would say, look, the time we have discussions about how much we're giving you is at the start of spending reviews, the 3-year spending review periods, and then we'll have a big discussion about what you think the things are you might like to spend money on. But outside that, you have to find the money yourself. So it was the default position. But in fairness to the Treasury, it was also a period when we had a massive hole in the national finances. The Treasury themselves were in deficit. So it was a very uncomfortable period for everyone.
Is a problem with that default position that the government can rebut arguments for the provision of financial support on the basis that will come out of direct patient care for others?
Well, I said that on one occasion, and the families were extremely angry that I said it, and indeed I said it in Parliament, because that was the uncomfortable reality of my position, that I knew that at that stage any additional support would have to come from the Department of Health budget, which was effectively the NHS budget, because that consumed the lion's share of it. I think that the truthful answer to your question is that a Prime Minister can decide at any stage that this is an exceptional situation and I want it to come out of contingency funding from the Treasury. I think David Cameron showed a lot of sympathy, and as you see from some of the responses he gave to my letters, but he was also very conscious that the national finances were in a terrible state as well. So I think that was what made it very difficult to resolve this.
And then just picking up on that, I think I explored with you earlier the idea that across government, so if you look at it as a government as a whole rather than an individual department, government can find the money for things it wants to do. It might be at the expense of other things, but nonetheless it can do that. Would you accept that the decision to not find the extra money to enhance the financial support schemes and hold a public inquiry was a question of won't, not can't?
I think that's putting it too starkly. I think it was very difficult. Of course, it is true. If the government, as we found, for example, in COVID, we suddenly needed to spend £400 billion, and we found the money, but we found it by adding to the national debt. And so, there are always consequences to these choices. So it is true that if you want to find the money for something as a Prime Minister or as a government, you can, but there may also be consequences which ultimately are consequences that ordinary people have to face the consequences of in the end. So I think that is what made this situation incredibly difficult. It was a contributory factor to the thing that I think is absolutely true, that it took too long for the state to resolve this issue. And I don't think any of us who were in government can escape our share of the responsibility that it took too long over successive governments to resolve it. So I've given you the specific circumstances during my period in office, but there were other things that happened much earlier, and I think the totality of this was a failure by the British state. I don't think there's any other way to describe it.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from the suggestions I've received. I'm just going to check with Ms Gray. No, there's nothing from Ms Gray. Do you have any questions for Mr Hunt?
Yes, I do. Is one way of describing what you've said about the difficulties there were in establishing an inquiry, that being that government was worried about how much it would cost in the end, or could cost, depending on what the inquiry recommended. Does that contrast with the other inquiries which you have been involved in? Because the health service is full of inquiries, and they've all been much smaller.
Yes.
So is this really a reflection of the sheer scale and size of what is involved in this inquiry?
Partially, yes. But the other inquiries that I set up weren't, I'm just trying to think, but I don't think they were public inquiries as legally constituted. The mid-staffs inquiry was, but I didn't set that up. That was set up by Andrew Lansley. But then the Patterson Review, the Cumberledge Review, the Gosport, the Morecambe Bay, these were independent inquiries, but they weren't public inquiries. And compensation wasn't the principal issue. In fact, I don't think it's the principal issue for people here. I think it's justice and the truth that matters most. But nonetheless, in this case, there was a potential for a large bill, as I think was evidenced by what happened in Ireland, which I think was what was on the minds of people when they were thinking about whether to have a public inquiry with respect to the contaminated blood scandal.
One of the things which also I think is reflected in the evidence which we've heard from those core participants and participants who've given evidence is their desire to learn that government and the medical profession and the administrative bodies involved learn the lessons of what has taken place so that it doesn't happen again, or something like it that doesn't happen again, or if it does, that it is dealt with in a rather better way. Part of that, of course, comes back to your suggestion that there should be a change of culture. Now, I've said this to one other witness, that in the health service, over the years, over the last 50 years, there have been quite a number of inquiries, most of which, and I think mid-staffs is no stranger, have said that what needs to change is the culture. And you've said, well, what we need to avoid the culture of blame. Or perhaps we need to have a culture of blame, but rather than blaming people for making a mistake, blame them for not admitting that they made a mistake. How do we achieve that?
Well, I think it's very well put, if I may say, Sir Brian. And when I introduced the duty of candour following the Francis inquiry, I looked at this. I looked at the issue as to whether we should have a duty of candour for individual doctors and nurses, and I was advised no, that should be done in their professional codes of conduct, but the legal duty of candour only applies to hospitals and healthcare organisations. And I wonder whether I should have gone further in that respect, because I think that what is not the case at the moment, this is slightly tangential to this inquiry, but for an individual doctor and nurse, I think the price should always be higher for not being transparent about what happened than for being transparent about what happened, which I think is exactly the point that you're making. So what I would say is that all the inquiries that concluded while I was Secretary of State, I used them to introduce measures in the health service that increased transparency and learning from mistakes, and they were practical measures. So, for example, from the Francis inquiry, I introduced the Ofsted rating of hospitals, GP surgeries and care homes so that we know where we get good care and where we don't get good care. We introduced the Learning from Deaths programme after the issues at Southern Health. We introduced medical examiners, or the implementation of medical examiners, which had long been recommended following the Morecambe Bay inquiry. So every single inquiry that reported, I used it as a moment to make changes that changed culture. And what I would say is that I think it's if you too conclude that culture needs to change with respect to these mistakes, I hope you might also think about what the practical measures are that can be done, because I think it's very easy for governments to say, yes, we agree culture needs to be changed. But the next question is, so what are you going to do about it? What's going to change to make that happen? And I think that there are things you can do. And when I started as Health Secretary, I ran a mile from anything to do with culture change, because I thought this is too nebulous. You're never going to get anywhere. And then in the end, I concluded, actually, the only real change is culture change, because that's when you change the way people think, and that's when you really change things forever. And I do think that the NHS is more open and more transparent. You've been generous enough, Mr. Richards, to quote from my book. I don't think it would have been possible 10 years ago for a former health secretary to write a book in which every single chapter talks about a terrible tragedy that's happened in the NHS and what went wrong, and for people to read that and take it at face value. I think that we have moved on, and we do talk about things that went wrong, but there's still a very, very long way to go.
Well, you suggested there that if I were to say, as a recommendation, that the culture should change in this or that respect, the next question is, how do you do it? Well, that really was what I was asking you.
Well, I have to be honest, I've given a lot more thought to this when it comes to clinical practice by doctors and nurses. And so I think that we need to do the things that I recommended in that litigation report that I did, where we need to move to no-fault compensation. But most importantly, when it comes to doctors and nurses, I think the law needs to be strengthened to recognise that there's a difference between the ordinary human mistakes that you and I make the whole time and unforgivable gross negligence. And we need to understand that doctors are going to make those human mistakes too, and sometimes people are going to die as a result of those mistakes, and they shouldn't be punished for making them because they're human beings like we are. What we should be doing is encouraging them to be open about them so we can learn from them. But that is not to say that someone should be given any latitude at all if they turn up to do an operation drunk, for example, or something like that. That's, that would be gross negligence. So I think doctors don't know where the line is between ordinary human error and gross negligence. And they're very nervous that if they own up to a mistake they've made, they're going to get dragged through a legal process where they'll be convicted of gross negligence. And you're the expert on this, not me, Sir Brian, but what I am advised by my lawyer friends is that the law is often applied inconsistently in different parts of the country, depending on which coroner you have, which police force you have, and indeed the views of a judge. And so it's very difficult for doctors to know where they stand. And other industries that have cracked this, like the airline industry, pilots really do know where that line is between ordinary human error that they can feel completely comfortable being open about. Forgetting to do check number 25 of 52 checks before they took off because they were distracted on the radio. They know that that's something that is a process problem, a system problem, not pilot error in a way that would mean that they should lose their license. In this inquiry, you're looking at something slightly different, which was which is potentially a catastrophic policy mistake potentially by a senior official working for the government. And to me, I think, I'm not sure I feel qualified to recommend the changes, but I think, if that happened, I think that there are two separate issues. First of all, why, if it happened, would someone think that it was acceptable to make a decision in which significant numbers of people were poisoned with absolutely catastrophic consequences? There is a view sometimes in medicine that you do something the greatest good for the greatest number, and there's going to be consequences for some unlucky souls along the way. Personally, I think that's completely wrong and not consistent with the values of the NHS, but that's that. But then I think the second question is, how could that have been swept under the carpet for so many years? And, we have the 30-year rule and we have all the sort of protections on advice that's given for ministers. And I just ask myself how that kind of failure could happen in the state. I'm sorry, I wish I did have a clearer answer for you, but that's...
Well, you've told me what you can, and I thank you for that. You mentioned there the airline industry, which of course isn't just a question of the pilots, it's a question of those who do the maintenance of the plane, those who check the plane over, those who license the plane to fly. It is, in effect, a system which the airline industry has largely sorted out. And you've talked about here the duty of candour being systemic, as it currently is. The problem is where they intersect. If you take the days when industrial injury litigation began, in effect, the 1800s, when the laundry girl working in the laundry vat with a big revolving machine paddle, who's worked for 12 hours and is supposed to work for 12 hours and gets tired and puts her hand in and loses it. That's really the fault of those who are operating the system, as opposed to what is always said or was said by the bosses in those days, it's her fault for being careless, which in one sense it was, but in a true sense it was the system. So you have the doctor who may work under pressure for too many hours with the lack of support from nurses because they're not there. Now, a mistake is made, it's human, but what is truly responsible for it? Him, the nurses, the hospital administration, or the system that requires that to happen? In order to resolve it, the answer would have to be that somebody has to say, well, yes, I was too tired. Yes, I did make a mistake. That's the starting point, isn't it?
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And that is why I think we are running serious risks with patient safety, having very stretched staff at the moment under enormous pressure. I think the chances of those kinds of mistakes happening are much greater because of the pressures that staff are under. There's another difference with the airline industry, which I think I only really came to understand late in my time as Health Secretary, which is that if you discover that the right wing nut on the left-hand engine of this type of plane needs to be checked every time the plane takes off or something like that, and if you say if you don't do this, there's a risk of that engine failing. You just need to issue a simple instruction like that, and every airline all around the world will immediately make sure they check that wing nut every time they take off. And you don't need to worry about implementation because the airlines, it's mission critical not to have a crash. But if you have a mistake that's made, for example, when a baby is being born, that in a certain situation you need to use this instrument or that instrument, whatever. It's not the case that just sending that out as an instruction means that every maternity department in the country will immediately follow that, because they are already receiving hundreds of instructions every single day on different issues, and they're also extremely busy delivering babies. And so when it comes to healthcare systems, you have to spend a lot more time working out how you're going to get the bandwidth of the people who are doing these things to change the system, because it won't happen automatically. So there's a much more thought needs to be given to implementation.
The changes which you've made in response to the various inquiries, the changes you've described, have you had a system of audit to check what effect they've actually had?
There are ways that we can check that.
Have you?
Yes.
And has it?
Yes, I would say so, but I'm a politician and I'm proud of my record in that respect. But, for example, following the Francis inquiry, we introduced the Ofsted system, so we didn't know which hospitals were good and which hospitals weren't. By the time I left office, 3 million more patients were using good or outstanding hospitals than when I arrived. It's now 4 million more patients using good or outstanding hospitals. So I think there was progress, and I do think the NHS is much more transparent. When I listened to Sajid Javid giving his response to the Ockenden report and being completely honest about the most terrible failings in NHS care in Shrewsbury and Telford, I thought that is a very big change. I was the first health secretary to stand at the dispatch box and talk in very graphic terms about NHS failures, and now here's two health secretaries on using exactly the same language. So I think there has been change. I think the NHS is more compassionate, but I wouldn't want to pretend that there's not a long way to go.
Thank you. Same sort of area in one sense is dealing with the question of how we challenge what has been received wisdom and may be wrong. One of the problems which has been discussed already in this inquiry has been the problem that civil servants may not stay, although they stay in post for longer than junior ministers, something which you've already said you find uncomfortable as a way of having a good or better government. But they do leave, and they leave perhaps more often than they used to. So there may be no easy access to departmental memory. And when you make statements, as are made here, the best available treatment at the time was given, and you make that statement 30 or 40 years after the treatment has actually been given, you may be simply parroting what somebody else has parroted the year before and the year before that and the year before that, without actually having a proper basis to found it on. How do we actually retain the ability to call up today quickly, because decisions have to be made quickly, you're focusing on the here and now, it's been stressed to me before, to make sure that actually you're telling of the past what it was?
You're asking me to answer in one sentence the most difficult question you've got to answer in your whole inquiry. I mean, I think it's not necessarily, in my experience, an issue about turnover, because in reality, sometimes it helps to have a new pair of eyes, because then they're prepared to challenge what their predecessor did. Whereas if someone stays in a very long time, they will obviously defend to the hilt decisions they took. I think it's more about having a robust challenge at the time that decisions are taken. And I think the best example I can give, which we haven't, an example we haven't talked about today, is something to do with pandemic preparations when I was Health Secretary. So we were ranked the second best prepared country in the world for pandemics. The best prepared country, I can see your eyebrows arching there, Sir Brian. The best prepared country was the United States of America, and that was Johns Hopkins University in Washington that made that assessment. And I was very proud of that as Health Secretary at the time. And we did Operation Cygnus, a huge 3-day exercise. And I even held an international summit of G7 health ministers to talk about pandemic preparedness. So we really thought we were on the ball. But the truth was, there was groupthink that if there was a pandemic, it would be a flu pandemic, because that's what we'd had before. And we hadn't given enough thought to the fact that it might be a different type of pandemic. So exercise Cygnus, which involved hundreds of civil servants and me as the Secretary of State at the time, you can look through the whole report, and testing is not mentioned once. There is no mention of testing at all. That turned out to be our biggest problem when we actually had that pandemic. And so I feel that there was a groupthink that said, if we have a pandemic in the future, it'll be similar to the pandemics we have in the past. And I think that what one needs to do is to put in place people whose job it is to challenge groupthink at every stage and make sure that, and it's particularly challenging in academia and in the civil service, because they're very consensual places where people don't like to upset each other. Everyone likes to try and find a solution that everyone's happy with. And people don't like flies in the ointment. But actually, you do need that. You need people who are going to challenge. And it can't just be ministers. I think that's the problem. Our system at the moment is built on the idea that actually the ministers are the ones who are going to come in and challenge the groupthink, the flies in the ointment. They're going to come in and say, no, it may have been done like this before, we're going to do it like this now. And everyone's conditioned to obey ministers. But we're not experts, and we don't have that institutional memory of those fields. And so you need contrary thinking civil servants who challenge perceived ways of doing things.
Slightly different topic. You mentioned Ebola in the course of your evidence. Now, Ebola can be transmitted by blood, can it not?
I wouldn't know, but
a hemorrhagic fever.
Yeah.
But to what do you attribute our relative success, as I think it probably is, in keeping this country free of Ebola?
Well, it took root in West Africa, in 3 countries in West Africa, and the World Health Organization failed to get its act together because they operate on a consensus basis, and it was very, very slow. And what actually happened was that 3 of the biggest aid donors in the world Britain, America and France just took one country each. We did Sierra Leone, and then America and France did Liberia and Guinea, respectively. And we just got on with it and tackled the problem at source. And so there was very, very clear lines of responsibility. We used the army, we used the NHS, we used our epidemiologists, but we were only doing Sierra Leone, and the French knew what they were doing, and the Americans knew what they were doing. And so it was successful for that reason, I think.
So you prevented the transmission by really dealing with it at source as best you could. I see.
Correct.
I think that's all that I have to ask. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hunt, is there anything further that you would like to add?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, there is something I want to add, which is to thank you and to thank you for your obvious candour and the reflective nature of what you've had to say, which has been really enlightening and helpful. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And tomorrow, sir, we return to Scotland with the evidence of Malcolm Chisholm.
Tomorrow, 10 o'clock.